There we go. Sorry for those of you who are like 2 rows up on this side. It's really just John and Lindsay. No, if you're far enough back there, if you want to be seen, you're going to have to jump up and down. Yeah, I sort of thought that would be your reaction. With the white sweater, if you move that blackboard in behind you, you're going to disappear. All right, because the camera's not that good. It makes me look decent sometimes, so it can't be that good. All right, so I joked before everybody got here this morning with Rob that this is actually going to be one of the more difficult classes to do because it's such an interesting class of Scripture. One that we don't read often, that we read really inconsistently, and to be honest, to read it consistently is difficult, and that's Old Testament wisdom literature. So what I mean by that are the books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Job. Are there 4 more different books that exist in the same category in the Bible? Like putting Song of Songs, Song of Solomon, take your pick, and Job in the same category is just overwhelmingly strange. And yet they both fit the description perfectly. They're both very much wisdom literature. They pass on information about life and how to live it, albeit in very different circumstances and in very different ways. But to me, that's what makes the books of wisdom literature in the Old Testament so valuable. They do cover so much of life. They cover love, and they cover loss, and they cover death, and they cover how to act in the public square and in the marketplace, and how to pick friends. This morning, I'm going to focus really heavily on Proverbs, mainly because I had to pick something. Covering all 4 of those books in one 45-minute setting is just... Yeah, for those of you shaking your heads, no, it's just not going to happen. And I'll try to loop in Job because of those 4 books. It's probably the one that we read and reference the most. And the others are going to get left by the wayside. If I'm honest, the real reason I'm not touching on Ecclesiastes is because I still don't know what to do with it. And what really makes it good is that the 2 guys who wrote the How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth book that I've recommended to you disagree vehemently on how you should read it. And they're like, here's the resources you should read. And I cracked open 2 of them and I said, I can't agree with myself on any of the stuff that I just read. So I just will leave it alone. Let's talk about wisdom in general. What the Bible means when it uses the term wisdom, what the people of Israel mean when they talk about wise or wisdom writings and literature. What they're really talking about is the ability to make godly choices. Wisdom literature books, those that I named off, are intensely practical for whatever is going on in life. But what that means then is they have almost nothing to say about theology, about doctrine, about church goings on. Their voices in those categories are silent. So for me, if I'm talking with somebody and their theological statement or their doctrinal choice is dependent on wisdom literature, then it's automatically, to me, one of those grain of salt moments. Because they're not standing on something that's meant to be stood on for that purpose. There's a whole lot of other text that is absolutely for that purpose. But the verse, better to live on the corner of a roof than in the house with a quarrelsome wife, has nothing to do with theology. There's not some grand statement it's trying to make about God. He's trying to make sure his son does a decent job of picking a wife. Steve, can you sit there? In all honesty, I picked that one because that was the one proverb that got taught during the guys' Bible study portion of summer camp when I was a teenager. So you can blame Kyle for that one. I know. That's what I mean. When you're reading these, they're punchy, short statements. They don't say everything that is true about a topic. They're meant to be very memorable. We have these in our culture, don't we? They have been passed on generation to generation, and you can finish most of them that I start. Always look before reading. Okay? That's a cultural proverb. And it says something about jumping. It's nice to know where you're going to land. True about, I wish our youngest would, I know, right? It also says something true about life, doesn't it? It's nice to know what's in front of you. Now, that's not to say that if you don't have a perfect plan moving forward, you should never, ever, ever jump. There are some great stories of people who have no idea what's coming next that take a leap into the abyss, and everything happens after that point is great. But if you move forward through life just jumping into holes, at some point you're going to find one that hurts you, not helps you. Okay? Another classic one for us, a penny saved, penny earned. Okay? But sometimes you've got to spend money. And sometimes that earning is not for you, but for somebody else. Generosity that stems from having enough to be able to share. Watch the company you keep. Wisdom about how you pick friends who you spend time with. Bad company corrupts. Good fences make. Which I love coming from the South, because that means if you don't maintain your dadgum barbed wire fence, your neighbor's going to be dragging your mule out of their field all the time, and at some point it gets exhausting. As somebody whose greatest resentment of my job was when our ranch owners decided they wanted to try and run buffalo. And there's no such thing as a good fence when it comes to a buffalo, just in case you're wondering how that went. And when you've got to get a buffalo off the highway, none of your neighbors are happy with you. That idea that having boundaries, that placing some limits on our time, on our guesses, which I'm not always good at, helps build quality relationships between people, helps avoid resentment and frustration. That's a wise saying, right? Are there moments when the fences should come down? Sure. But good fences are a pretty good start. An apple a day, which again is not like just a sales slogan for the apple industry. It's a recognition that paying attention to what you put in your body helps you moving forward. Like if I just shovel Big Macs day in and day out, at some point, not too long after that effort begins, I'm going to suffer significant physical consequences. I should also eat more than just apples. And sometimes some days are going to include 2 apples. But there's some wisdom in understanding that. So Proverbs don't say everything true about a subject. They point towards something that is true. And it's our job to read them and figure out which direction that they're pointing. But part of that means that sometimes you're going to read a proverb and your experience is not going to line up with the proverb. That's not how it happened for me. That's okay, because they don't point to everything that is true. They point towards something that is usually true, some guidance of wisdom to help you move forward. So, as an example,
is the characteristic of wisdom is that there's some wisdom that's conventional, and then there's some wisdom that's subversive.
Sure.
And it'll say one thing, and then it'll say something the opposite.
And the Proverbs contain both.
Yeah.
And also a recognition that life is not simply a straight line between A and B. Sometimes that line goes all over the map because it loops in all of these different experiences of life. Do not correct a fool. Correct the fool. Okay, Proverbs, make up your mind. There are moments that just not responding is the best option. There are moments that you have to say something. And part of that depends on your relationship to the fool. If it's somebody on a street corner, I'm less likely to say something than if it's my son being dumb. Right? The nature of the relationship changes. I'm sorry, am I the only one? None of you have ever had friends or children that take off down a path of stupidity that you kind of have to be like, grab the collar and drag them back. Here's why that's a terrible idea. And then watch them go do it anyway. Experience is the best teacher. Another wonderful proverb. So for the case of an example.
I just want to say one quick comment that I was at San Jose Airport and I had this belt buckle with a little derringer on it, it was fake and all that. Well, I went through security and they didn't like it much. And when the police officer came up to me and he says, if you would have grabbed it, I would have shot you. My first inclination was to say, well, you need training, and I managed to keep my mouth shut.
But also, maybe don't wear that belt buckle through the airport again, right? There are two areas of learning to be done. Like, y'all, life is entertaining. And I think that may be what makes the Proverbs so fun, is because there are so many examples like that in there where there's learning to be done. And some of the Proverbs get really funny on how they handle that, or how they talk about people, how they talk about life situations. For the sake of right now, in one of the longer stretches of proverbial wisdom from the Proverbs, I want to take a look at Proverbs 6, starting in verse 24, if you want to turn along. A lot of the Proverbs are short and punchy. Sometimes they pair those together in a line to say something bigger about some particular, topic. So 24 through 35, I'm going to read. And then I want you paying attention to the ways in which this holds true, and also ways in which that you've seen it not hold true. And we'll talk about that towards the after we read through it. Here we go. 24 through 35. It will keep you from the immoral woman, from the smooth tongue of a promiscuous woman. Don't lust for her beauty. Don't let her coy glances seduce you, for a prostitute will bring you to poverty. But sleeping with another man's wife will cost you your life. Can a man scoop a flame into his lap and not have his clothes catch on fire? Can he walk on hot coals and not blister his feet? So it is with the man who sleeps with another man's wife. He who embraces her will not go unpunished. Excuses might be found for a thief who steals because he is starving. But if he's caught, he must pay back 7 times what he stole, even if he has to sell everything in his house. But the man who commits adultery is an utter fool, for he destroys himself. He will be wounded and disgraced. His shame will never be erased. For the woman's jealous husband will be furious, and he will show no mercy when he takes revenge. He will accept no compensation, nor will he be satisfied with a payoff of any size. Generally true wisdom, correct? You start messing with relationships that cross boundaries into other people's families, things can and usually do go sideways very, very quickly. That is a generally true statement, right? But not everybody gets caught.
That's what stood out to me. But if he gets caught.
But if he gets caught. Using the example of a thief is like it's better to be that guy than this guy. With the recognition that, or there are other things that hold true. Sometimes the challenges a relationship presents takes you to a point where you have this event, and healing actually begins from that point forward. Where actual conversation and forgiveness can come. Relationships that move forward after those sorts of challenges can often be strong. There's some beauty that can be found there and some lessons that pass from others. It does not automatically destroy the house, right? There are also moments wherein the challenges that existed in that relationship led to a point of exactly what needed to happen. Which sounds weird to say, because I feel like what I grew up with was there's never an excuse for a divorce, ever, 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 ever. But I'm sorry, if a dude's been beating on his wife for 20 years and that's her path out, then that's her path out. And what it's gotten to her to is a point that needed to come before for some very different reasons. That does not excuse the action, but it doesn't fit in with this generally true proverb.
Well, I just wanted to mention Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 31.
Yeah.
Teach just the opposite of what this other one does.
Well, and Proverbs 31 doesn't line up. Women in the Old Testament in general, the map is all over on what gets celebrated, whether it's silence or jail with a tent peg, like somewhere between those 2 points. Again, the Proverbs don't make a one statement that's true for all time thing. It's cast as Solomon giving advice to his young child, and then adopted by Israel as children of God as advice for them on how to operate in the world. And one of the things that it's often reminding the child of is that actions have reactions and consequences. Those are not always true. I've got a line of Proverbs that we'll work our way through here in just a minute where your reaction will be yes or no or sometimes. Because that's the nature of the Proverbs. They do not make always true statements forever. They offer wisdom and guidance for the types of situations we find ourselves in life. And some warnings and cautions for people who have not yet made those choices, but might. They don't offer a whole lot of reaction. It's a lot of caution. The Proverbs don't usually say, and if you do this, then. Because the hope of the giver of wisdom is that you won't do that. It doesn't give you then the routes to get back to where you started.
How do you suggest you read the Proverbs? Do you just begin in the beginning and go all the way to the end? Or is there another way to approach it?
So for me, like basically everything else I've suggested, the Proverbs are meant to be taken in sum. Because as a Hebrew person in the 3rd century, you would not have just had a couple of Proverbs in your head. This would have been the aphorisms that you grew up with, in the same way that we grew up with all of those ones that I read off, and plenty more. How many more of those little cultural proverbial statements can you come up with than the ones that I did? Like, right, a ton of them. So this is what you swim in if you're a person who grows up in that community. You're meant to hear all of them. Because they respond to situations, not to everything. Does that make sense? Yeah, Karen.
I'm thinking also, back in that culture and time, women were not educated. So notice all the books are usually written for men.
Well, and even
so all those things don't look upon a woman and all this. I mean, you got to it's you can't take it so literal. Then that's just the guy's problem. But women have to look at the opposite also.
Well, and again, so even the Hebrew word that very often our translations move to, it says my son, listen my son, or something like that. The Hebrew word isn't son. Child is the better translation. It speaks to a generic. Solomon doesn't want this wisdom limited to one person. This is meant to be taken in by the community. And again, you take the general and apply it to the situational. It's very much the idea behind these proverbs. All right, so I want to jump ahead.
So a nagging wife can also be seen as a nagging husband?
No.
No. Yes. Absolutely. Again, it's meant to speak to situations. It's not meant to offer, like, rules.
But Henry, I was just raising my hand to kind of comment on Karen's comment in that as we went through Proverbs on the Friday morning group for like years, slowly, but we found that oftentimes the proverb had to be taken as though what were they thinking then, which is what your point is for this class and many of the other ones, is that in context, what did they hear 2,000, 3,000 years ago?
Well, sure. If you try to read them literally, then I'll circle back to the one we started with, because to me it's the great one to laugh at. The corner of the house one, right? Better to live on the corner. Well, sure, in the ancient world with a flat roof in a desert climate, you can get away with camping out on the roof. In fact, it was quite normal for there to be beds on their flat roofs because, depending on the temperature outside, you didn't want to be in the house. Also, if you've had to move the animals into the foyer downstairs, which again is how houses would have been built in the ancient world, you don't necessarily want to be right there next to the snow. So sometimes you want to be on the corner of the roof. Do you then take that and apply it to our steep-pitched roofs in the Pacific Northwest when they're loaded with snow and ice? Better to slide off of your roof is not what the guy is trying to talk about. And again, he's not even necessarily talking about relationships between husbands and wives. He's talking about the caution you should take when you pick a spouse.
But Henry, Proverbs change if you read them at different periods in your life. Because Craig has this habit where on, September 1 he reads Proverbs 1 and he does that every month.
Yeah, you got the month of Proverbs.
I started doing that, and Proverbs say different things to you that you said, well, I didn't pick that up last month.
Well,
But that it has to do sometimes with your life and
Well,
the crises you're in.
and one of the things that I've pointed out, I think a couple of times as we've done this, is and I think you probably have a pretty good grasp on this because you spend time working in the synagogue. Open interpretation is a very Jewish way of reading Jewish scriptures. There's a rabbinic argument to be made that there are like 70 facets. In fact, that's the number that's given to every passage. That's not meant to say that you've got to come up with all 70 interpretations to every passage you're reading. It's a reminder that passages are not flat. They have depth. So one month, when I'm reading about the importance of discipline, and I'm dealing with my own kid, it's a reminder that those moments where I think I'm too tired to deal with this, I'll take care of it tomorrow, maybe those are moments when I should pause and offer correction. It's also a reminder to have a little bit of grace with the kids that I deal with when I'm substitute teaching, because not every kid has somebody who's willing to guide them. Those are two very different readings of the same passage. Both should move me to respond in some way or another, but both of those responses are incredibly situational, aren't they? All right, so a few that I want to roll through. One, and we're going to try and just move quickly here. So Proverbs 13:1. A wise child accepts a parent's discipline. A mocker refuses to listen to the correction. True, not true? Good answer, Rob. Because there's such thing as bad discipline, right? Not every guidance offered by parent to child is good. And I would like to hope that I raise my kid in a way that if I give them bad guidance, bad advice, or bad correction, that they're able to respond and go, no.
No, parents have wisdom.
There's plenty of the fool that exists in the text. Yes?
I was going to say, if you have a kid that will argue with everything you say and do, what do you do with that?
So that's a parenting class conversation. That's not what we're doing today. Because, again, the Proverbs isn't a parenting class. It's advice and direction. But it doesn't give you a how to respond in every situation guidance. Because one of the responses that people have is to give up. Right?
Or argue.
And depending on the kid, either one of those could turn out great. Sometimes what they need you to do is back off so that they can, run the car into the tree and figure out what direction to go next. Sometimes that's the exact moment that you need to pick them up and drag them somewhere else. Again, very situational. We don't get a whole lot of direction. 13:3. Those who control their tongues will have a long life. Opening your mouth can ruin everything. True, not true?
True.
Except, there are plenty of people who seem to run their mouths and have very long lives. And I know a lot of people who are the absolute model of moderation that don't.
And there's a good time to open your mouth.
Yes.
So.
Again, guidance, not universally true statements, right? How you speak does not decide the span of your life. But all of these things that I'm offering up as alternatives are ways people have tried to apply these passages. Oh, well, if I can just say as little as possible, then I'll never have enemies and life will go great for me. That's not what that's trying to communicate. 16:4. Lazy people want to get lazy people want much but get little, but those who work hard will prosper. Always true?
No.
How many of you have friends that you know work insanely hard and are paycheck to paycheck, month to month? Yeah. How many of you can point to somebody who you feel like is probably doing very, very little but is absolutely skating on everything? Oh, to be a trust fund baby. Mom, Dad, we have these. I worked in residence life at Abilene Christian University, it's a private college, fairly wealthy clientele. And the differences in the students between those who are only there because scholarship money exists, and those who have never had to work for anything in their lives, that scale is huge, and you kind of watch it play out in front of you. Sometimes the kid with the Jaguar in the parking lot is incredibly kind and generous and only has that car because his parents basically said, this is your vehicle. Cool. But that didn't change the nature. Sometimes the kid with the Jaguar in the parking lot is an absolute jerk who feels entitled to everything. Which is also true of the kid with the beat up Honda. Not universally true statements, but things that point out things in life that we see, right? Okay, let's go 14:20. This is a favorite. The poor are despised even by their neighbors, while the rich have many friends. And in my text, it puts it in quotation marks. I love the scare quotes. Again, Hebrew doesn't have that sort of punctuation. I really wish it did, because then we know a little bit more about what to do with passages like this. But you have this recognition, sometimes mirrored in the Old Testament, right? The wealthy son who takes the inheritance, who flies off to foreign lands, has a bunch of friends until he doesn't have money and then doesn't have friends anymore. So if this wisdom is given to a child of the palace who's going to have lots his entire life, then what is this a warning of? Choose your friends wisely. Because some are going to be showing up because you have something to give them. And some are going to be there because you care. Even knowing the context of palace life changes how we read this, right? Yeah?
I think that's why it follows 21.
Yes.
Because it ties right into that.
If it's a sin to belittle one's neighbor, blessed are those who help the poor. So again, good wisdom. But sometimes difficult to understand how to apply, or, better in our context, we just don't want to apply. Fair? It's a whole lot easier to hold on to what we have than be generous in a lot of situations. And one of the things that I think, that's a different conversation for a different day. I'm going to stop. 14:1. Sorry, I ended up jumping down further than I wanted to. A wise woman builds her home, but a foolish woman tears it down with her own hands. So that means the houses of the wise in Israel were built by women, right?
I think so.
The best construction workers. That's not making any statement on the nature of construction in the ancient world, is it? You've got to add some depth and reading to what you're doing, because if you read Proverbs in flat ways, you miss the point. Instead, this is a recognition that how you operate in home life matters. It affects things that come out of the house. All right, 14:7. Stay away from fools. You won't find knowledge on their lips. How far away do I have to stay? The Bible doesn't give me a restraining order distance here, right? Or should I always stay away? Because sometimes we're supposed to offer correction, but not all the time. And again, very situational guidance about how to live. And again, I think this shows up in some of our modern application about choosing your friends. If you surround yourself by people who have no wisdom, if you surround yourself by people who drag you sideways, then you're inevitably going to end up sideways. Given to the son of the palace, the child who made him king. This is a reminder that who's in his court, who his advisors are, matters. What happens with Solomon's sons and the advisors that they have? They didn't listen. Sometimes that wisdom doesn't get passed down, and even the relationship between wisdom literature and historical narrative provides some guidance for us as we read it. 16:3. Another one of my favorites of weird ways it's been interpreted. Commit your actions to the Lord and your plans will succeed. Anybody ever heard this one used? This is one of my favorites, because one of the ways that it has been applied, thankfully not by the people who I grew up with, but I've gotten to witness this and read it in a couple of other cases, is if you take the time to stop and tell your plans to God, then God will make your plans happen. Any guesses as to what current religious movement, Christian movement in the United States this is popular with? Say it. Louder. The health and wealth gospel. Joel Osteen and the health and wealth movement.
Yeah.
If you commit your plans to the Lord, as if telling God or writing it down in some sort of prayer journal is all it takes to then automatically have a good outcome. And if your plans don't succeed, that just means you weren't faithful enough. Not at all how this is meant to be read, but a way that it gets used if you're not paying attention to context. Instead, this is a recognition, recognition is the wrong word, an encouragement to commit yourself to the Lord's plans. That doesn't mean you get to pick the path. It means you pick who you follow, because that's the path that matters. But again, things get lost in translation or in our desires to read it one way or the other, and the outcome can be pretty rough. All right, 1525, just to prove that I haven't been making this up for those of you who did not automatically know where to find it because of your church camp upbringing. Oh, no. That would be 2524. Ooh. I messed up. 1525. That's 1625. Y'all, I promise I'm organized. The Lord tears down the house of the proud, but he protects the property of the widow. Universally true statement?
Was that 16?
1525. I nearly messed it up. The Lord tears down the house of the proud, but he protects the property of the widow. Solomon's palace wouldn't have survived Solomon's reign if this was universally true. And there wouldn't have needed to be so much concern about the widow's property in the time of the Old and New Testament if God was automatically doing the protecting. Instead, it should be God's people who are doing the protecting. The encouragement throughout the Old Testament is there for that. And you can read the collapse of the kingdom. That's the tearing down of the house of the proud. But that takes centuries, not hours. I think we want some of these things to automatically be true, right? Yeah. Here's somebody who made a horrible mistake. Justice demands that their house fall down. Read that as literally or as figuratively as you want. And one of the challenges then that has come with this over the years, hundreds of years of Christian reading, is that an area has an earthquake and a house falls down. And people then reach to the Proverbs as if it was trying to make a statement about who caused the earthquake or the hurricane, but that's not what this is talking about. Yeah, I know.
But it just after every disaster.
Every single one of them.
It happened.
This is because such and such a place was such a sinful city. Las Vegas is still standing.
Back to Job, wasn't that what his friend said?
Yes. And that marks the transition of what we're... No, one more. I've got to prove that it's there. 25:24. Because I've joked about it so much. Because it actually exists twice in the Proverbs. It's better to live alone on the corner of an attic than with a quarrelsome wife in a lovely home. Which is not what the Hebrew says. It's what the New Living Translation is translated. It's the corner of the house. I wasn't on the translator, so I can't help them. Do what?
Can I give
Sure.
you a verse? 18:22.
The man who finds a wife finds a treasure, and he receives favor from the Lord. Absolutely. Again, wisdom being passed. And notice that some of these read one to one. The next one ties into the one that follows. But then the one that comes after that may be completely unrelated. These are meant to be easily remembered, short, punchy statements, often poetic, nice song lyrics. They're fans of alliteration in Hebrew. Stuff that can be remembered. This wisdom matters, and it matters for the people in general and for Solomon passing this on of how you... Interesting, right, that Solomon would be so concerned about how you pick a wife? He may have made a few good choices in his hundreds of choices, but it's also telling that some of those choices end up being the reason that things go sideways so quickly for him, which again highlights the nature of paying attention to the wisdom. If Solomon had listened to Solomon, perhaps we don't end up with a northern and southern kingdom. But Solomon, the wisest person, doesn't listen to Solomon. Which then also makes him the dumbest person ever, right? Because he has the wisdom but he doesn't apply it. And that's where I want to close out the Proverbs, because what matters in the Proverbs is applying the wisdom.
He didn't have wisdom toward the end of his life, but he did have it early on.
Well, so wisdom is revealed in the application. And what you see over time in Solomon's life is wisdom lost. I don't know that it's as simple as it's there one moment and gone the next. Because I don't think that holds up to our experience, the human experience, does it? But there's this path that you walk down further and further and further, and suddenly you get Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Because what you knew no longer is what you do. And the Proverbs are very interested in what you do. All right, I have 5 minutes to talk about Job.
Ready to go.
All right. Job is still wisdom literature, but it is not proverbial, it's conversational. And you must read it as a conversation. And so much of what it highlights is the gap between human wisdom and divine reality. Because human wisdom, as represented by the friends who keep coming and giving Job advice to just confess, and his wife, who there's some Proverbs about, that isn't echoed by God, but is very much an echo of cultural wisdom. It's wisdom, but it's not godly wisdom. And I think that should be really challenging for us, because these are people who talk about God, right? They encourage him to turn to God. They beg him to reach out to God for forgiveness, because they know that God is in control. Which sounds very personal. Like, right? As people, I think you could say that about many of us as believers, about what we want for our neighbors. Yes?
So how much is human wisdom based on what humans can see?
Yeah.
That's very much, I think, Job.
Did y'all hear that?
No.
Say it louder. You gotta, come on.
I'm sorry. So how much is human wisdom based on what humans can see? I think that's very much the reality of the story of Job.
I think our wisdom is often limited by our experience.
Yes.
Because we see this all the time, I think, if we're paying attention, where somebody will give us a thought or an experience, some lesson that they've learned. And if it doesn't line up with what we've experienced, our immediate reaction is pushback. I think genuine wisdom leaves room for all of it, because life is much bigger than me. But there's challenges in knowing how to navigate relationships where those experiences are so very different. Because what Job has is an experience with God that does not match what his friends do, right? Job is somebody who's described as upright and blameless. And I would kill for that description of me, but then I'd also lose the upright and blameless part because I killed for it. Job, from the drop of the hat in the book, is the best guy we've ever known. His friends do not get that description, do they? And yet, who do they blame for Job's pain? Job. Human wisdom. And everyone else would agree with them, not Job.
But Job didn't agree with the human wisdom, but he had a case.
Yes.
And I admire him for just standing and saying, hey, Lord, I'm in the right. I have a case. I want to bring it before you and justify.
And he's correct.
Yeah.
Job is correct. One of the painful parts about the book of Job, for anybody who's an honest reader of the book of Job, is the outcome is, ugh. Yeah, you're blameless. Sorry. And we read the end of Job as if everything is set right. But I'm sorry, Job still lost his children, and the new ones don't replace that. And acting as if everything is fine in the end is a really dishonest reading of the text as we have it. And would not have been how it would have been read by the earliest audience. But we want to make things nice and comfortable and clean. See, Job was faithful, so he got everything back. I'm sorry, if you took my 3 kids from me and then sprinkled in 3 new ones down the road, I'm going to be a bitter, angry person. And that's not going to be justified, in my opinion, in any way, form, or fashion. And reading this story as if that's how Job reacts to all of it, that's a terrible read. Instead, what we have is this recognition that just because God is in control does not mean that good people get good and bad people get bad. Because there are other things at work in our world. And that's hard because we don't want that to be true. We want the nice, linear, good people get good things, bad people get bad things, because then I can make judgment statements about how people's lives are going as to whether or not they're great people. One of the movies that I loved as a child that I went back and watched, and it doesn't hold up at all, was Bedazzled. Brendan Fraser, Elizabeth Hurley. He gets 3 wishes. He makes a pact with the devil. Ice Cube is God in the end of the story, which is just... The first thing he asks is to be rich and powerful, and she turns him into a Colombian drug lord.
Oh, no.
Which challenges biblical wisdom because she's right. Rich and powerful. Pretty easy life. Aside from worrying about whether your underlings are going to usurp you and murder you in your sleep. But, aside from that, that challenges wisdom. Because bad people sometimes get good things. Often get good things. And good people often get bad things. And maybe what that should destroy, and I think what Job is pointing to more often than we want to admit it, is that there are no good or bad people. His friends aren't destroyed for being terrible people at the end. They may be challenged and told they're wrong. They come out the other side. They come out the other side fine. I'd argue that they come out much better than Job does. Job comes out having learned more, but they've lost less.
So who can say when they study the book of Job or read the book of Job, they honestly don't feel some anger towards God?
I don't know.
I mean, I can admit that.
Yeah. But I think that's...
Go ahead.
And that's good. Because it recognizes that experience is not clean. Right? That our desire for good or bad, black or white, whatever, however we want to term that, doesn't line up with reality. And what's really challenged in the book of Job is our understanding of reality. The statements that God makes, and I've got to stop talking because we're over time. The statement that God makes, God does not justify God's self in the book of Job. God just tells Job to stop. He says, I'm God and you're not. You weren't there when the world was formed. You don't get to understand everything that happens. Your responsibility is how you react, how you live in the world that is around you. And sometimes that means living through some real hardship, which we don't want. Sometimes that means telling your friends to shut up, which Job doesn't do and may have been better off if he had.
I just wanted to make one point.
Yeah.
Is that, we all go through struggles in life. And 1 John verse 9, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So that's where we need to be headed, is confessing our sins and bettering our life and doing what God would want us to do.
And wisdom literature says there's wisdom in knowing how to apply it.
Yes.
Because Job's friends would tell Job that exact same thing, which is not the concern in the book of Job. So we've got some responsibility for knowing when and when not the blame of the other is. Anyway, yes, I got to stop and we got to wrap up, but yes. All right. Job in 9 minutes. There we go.